delve into in brainstorming what the central problems are in relationship sustainability and what solutions might be possible and certainly need to be explored. And I don't think that we can have a 10x culture, a 10x community, or a 10x relationship school, be that high or anything else, until these issues are resolved. And so the first and I think most chronic issue is trust. And the trust is tied in to the question, will someone make a choice that hurts the group, that hurts the well-being of the majority, in order for a short-term gain for a minority? And this is a real question because if the behavior is kept secret, it is possible in the short term to create an illusion of well-being for a minority at the expense of a majority that is, quote, sustainable as long as it's secret. And so the broader response to this is advances in consciousness, so that we start to become more aware of what's going on chemically, biologically, off the screen. Because while our field of conscious vision has a limit, the interconnectedness of what's going on in this field and what's going on out here does not have a limit. I'm sitting in this chair that is being supported by the deck that is off screen. The supports are not on the screen. And so the kind of thinking that preserves what's going on here at the expense of undermining the pillars that are holding up the whole deck, that is holding what's going on in this screen in place, is unsustainable. It's short-term thinking. Now, in relationships, which is the focus of this video, so what are some of the types of issues and challenges where unsustainable patterns go on? What are the problems, basically, that deteriorate most relationships? Well, in romantic relationships, inseminating a woman out of marriage and without the commitment to raise the child, you could say this is one of the problems, because it feels good for the man to not use a condom, and as long as he can disappear into a major city or disown the child, or in some way blame the woman, there is an incentive of short-term sexual pleasure with the woman left with the biological, but also the psychological pain of the situation. Because regardless of whether you support a woman's right to choose abortion, there is post-abortion depression, there is angst, there is uncertainty. I mean, if there's no uncertainty, you're dealing with a level of arrogance that I certainly can't relate to. I do not know. the full implications biologically, emotionally, etc. of an abortion, from the medicine that facilitates the abortion and how that affects the female body, to the emotional implications, to, there are enormous repercussions to giving birth to a new energy, this third energy that comes into being between two people, and to terminating that, to terminating it as a possibility. There's a consequence to that. There's a consequence to terminating it as a probability, and there's a consequence to terminating it in the density of actuality. And so here we have this phenomena which, in some countries such as Thailand, I would say 80% of the women I meet are raising children from fathers that aren't there, that are not contributing. Now, I mean, this is, and this is permissed and somewhat accepted culturally. Well, it's not sustainable in terms of a balanced relationship. What you don't get with that kind of attitude is, see, there's a cost, of course. The women who have 1, 2, or 3 children from 1, 2, 3 different men who have all persuaded them to have sex without a condom and then walked away, the woman, now we're dealing with 80% of women in many cases, so these women are, of course, not as excited about meeting the next man. So it's not good for the culture, it's not good for the species to have, protocols of betrayal lead to lower and lower levels of interest and engagement, which leads to lower and lower qualities of relationship. So you meet someone, you fall in love, and they're thinking, I'm just going to deal with more pain and financial crises down the road. And so the question of how to solve this is a noticeable issue that varies somewhat by country and culture, but it has to be dealt with in some way. Now this, how to respond to this, and what's the medicine for anonymous betrayal? I think making it more known is one medicine, and so if we look at that problem, I think one tool, one technology would be a Yelp of people, where as a man and as a woman, your relationship pattern follows you, which it does. You see, the trouble is it does follow you, but one is able to constantly wipe the slate clean and put on a performance for the next person. I would never do that, etc., 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 except that you have done it many times, So I think that this is a good medicine, that unsustainable behaviors that are unkind, that unfairly burden one person with psychological, financial, physical results of a jointly made decision. I think these should be noted. And I think that would be a good a good technology, a Yelp of people, where the people who are transparent, who participate, are considered much more safe and stable than those who do not, where it's linked in blockchain, and where it's understood that relationship patterns generally do continue until there is a force, and one of those forces can be social shame or social fear, because it's a pretty tough sell to have your relationship history be 30 abortions are behind you with 30 angry women who are all saying basically the same thing. He said this, he said this, he said this, and then he left. So I think blockchain technology, app technology, etc., is a good response. The other response is small community. Sociologists have shown that we cannot be intimate with more than, at the very most, 150 people, and it's probably closer to 75, to or so. So if we understand that, somewhere between 75 people and 100 people are the level of people we can truly understand in all their different phases of life, if we grow up and spend time together over decades, then we can see the value of the tribe, the small community, the small group that is sustainable. So we have proximity and knowing and being known through proximity. We have the blockchain technology of, a retina fingerprinted pattern that we understand the social patterns of individuals in the blockchain technology. One of the things that we need to deal with is lying. And this is a difficult thing, but I think that media and blockchain provide some answers, not all, but provide some answers. But these are the questions. So the irresponsible insemination, that's, I think, a yelp of people. And this could be as simple as women saying, well, if you're not on Yelp, and if you're not going under a fingerprinted verified profile, I don't want to date you. And if you are, I, of course, want to look at your profile, and let's talk about it. And where everyone has a vote, where it's, so I think moving towards a more transparent world for all, whether it's government officials, whether it's this, that, the other, I think that this is a healthy move in responsibility and in trust, because trust is ultimately the most powerful and sacred thing in relationship. Now, this gets into a couple of different things. To have trust facilitates enormous amounts of liquidity enormously efficiently. But for trust to be sustainable rather than broken, it requires a mutual consideration and sincere effort towards towards a good relationship. Now, if we look at lies, one of the things that if we understand that lies destroy trust, and the reason I see trust as so sacred is that if I can trust my environment, first of all, I don't need to spend the $300 on the alarm system in my car. I don't need to spend the $300 on the security system of my house. I don't need to spend the 30% of my energy looking around for threats. Who's judging me, who's doing this, who's doing that, etc. So what we're seeing is an instant reduction in a 300% cost that is required if there's even 2% untrust. Meaning if I go out of my house 100 times and 2 times that I go out without a door being locked, my things are stolen, that's enough to require the lock. But if it gets down to 0.001% or less distrust, it becomes more bother to lock the door, check, think, etc. for the odd thing that goes missing. At that point, when we can trust someone to, 1, respect boundaries, 2, be honest, 3, have a good intention, when we can trust someone to do these 3 things, we can reduce at least 30% of the energy expenditures at every level. Meaning, we're talking about tax reductions, we're talking about military reductions, we're talking about house lock reductions, we're talking, and this is interesting, in Qatar, they have security cameras at every street corner, and so Lamborghinis sit there with keys in the car because they can find the criminal in a matter of hours. So there's a movement towards greater transparency reliably equals greater trust. Now, what we haven't seen in a centralized government there is the sharing of power. Because what we have is a government that has more knowledge about its citizens, but can presumably use the power of government to not have the police look at the government official who's taking a bribe or who's doing this and that and the other. And so what we need to have is a centralized sharing of this information, so that there's not a blind spot, that the looking goes both ways. And I think that what this does is it tips the balance between it being more efficient to lie, to where occasionally people will still lie, but the amount of inefficiency it will take them to convince all the people not to look at what's happening on the monitor, not what to look at their general pattern over a lifetime, you see, because then you have to see, well, they're going to have to be arguing against the app for an entire lifetime, because it's just too much effort. And that's what we want to tilt, is we want to tilt an awareness, because it's basically forcing the real consequence that's happening off the screen of the individual ego or entity onto their screen, because they're linked with their impact over time. I think this is an excellent technology response, because what we're looking at is, what do we need to have a healthy, sustainable culture? What we need are trustworthy relationships, and trust can be broken down. And this is also, I think, a good differential, that we need many forms of trust. An app can tell a person the probability of which they're going to be late. So you set an appointment with someone, and your app has tracked your GPS and your calendar over the last 5 years and can say this person has a 80% chance of being on time for a business meeting and a 30% chance of being on time for a romantic date. You're on a romantic date with that person. Their statistic shows up 30% chance of being on time. Now, are you going to rush to finish dressing and putting on your makeup for someone who has a 30% chance of being on time? Or maybe just enjoy the moment and say, well, I show up on time for people who are at least 80% reliable. You aren't, so I'm arriving when it feels good to me. And so, there's a little bit of fun there. Now, this has to start, of course, somewhere, and it needs to start in a community. When a community, to be part of this community, you need to show your data. So, and there are often unhealthy imbalances of power in any community, in any group of people. So one of the technologies that I think that can be employed is called metadata. And this is an encrypted app function that can allow anyone in a community to share something anonymously. Now, when you have the ability to share something honestly or transparently, meaning this is me saying this at this time about so-and-so in this time, and you have the ability to share it anonymously, this gives a good indication of the safety level of various subtle forms of retaliation or fear in the community. So it gives a message. If you can allow both forms of communication, this is the black, what's on the black, kind of what's being said and thought behind the scenes. And then this is what people are willing to say. So, for example, if every time someone brings up any problem with person X, they have to listen to an hour-long rebuttal, they're going to stop bringing up small problems with person X because it's not worth the hour-long rebuttal that seems to always happen. And so what would happen there is the small things would show up in the black or the metadata function. So-and-so late as usual, and I'm not bringing this up because there's always some excuse and I don't want to hear it. Well, this is a profile of trust. It is a profile of the possibility of liquidity. Now, when you have a metadata function and you have a direct and open function, and when things are linked, I think that the value of a community, the value of a group of people in that 70 to 150 person range that you are in proximity with, is in it is in the trust, and it is in the fluidity. It is in the fluidity and grace with which you are able to create high levels of well-being. Of course, without without waste. It's not that someone else is getting dramatically hurt so that you can have your affair. And so here are some of the things, and I'll reference the Human Awareness Institute in this simply because I took 100 events, 30 workshops, and a variety of events to learn how to have healthy relationships. And so if I watch partner A telling me that she's cheating on partner B, and of course she doesn't want him to know, what do I do to restore trust? Like, what's a protocol? We need, in order for something like this to be really a healthy community and teach something useful, you've got to know what to do there. And I think, in the middle of the flow of a group and all that, this is difficult, but metadata is a good thing. So-and-so just told me they're cheating on their husband. Now, why is this good? Well, first of all, it is happening. It's not like not talking about it means it doesn't happen. Second of all, the husband almost invariably finds out. It's just at a point when it does a lot of damage. Now, if this is nipped in the bud, what's a healthier thing for the community? Well, I think just saying, I'm not willing to be monogamous, and going through a protocol. You see, there's biological connections to the body. We need to understand this. So we need a technology that can measure and is in sync with the biology of the body. For example, there are grief cycles within the body. And if it takes someone 30 days to really release a deep partnership, biologically, to go through the cycle where you're not biologically reacting to what the other person is doing, this is biology. You can't lie to that. You can't rationalize with biology. And we are unfortunately not entirely at the level of science in a chauvinistic culture where we know the biology of attachment. But I can guarantee you, from enough anecdotal data and my own experience, that there are moments when someone lying and betraying to me in certain biological configurations would literally feel worse than being burned alive. And there are moments when it means, well, that's just someone doing their thing. And the difference is biology. It's the way the person is linked mentally, emotionally, biologically to certain things that have an emotional charge biologically. For example, if a child is lied to by their parent in a helpless and traumatic state, such that lying reenacts and induces a biological trauma, this is not something that can be rationalized away when someone lies to you in the present day. There is a biology, and that biology needs to be understood as much as possible by the people interacting with that individual. Because if you do have a traumatic biological link to lies, as I do, for example, lying to a person in that linking state with trauma is a very different impact than lying someone who's in a more detached state. Now, it's, so knowing what brings that into proximity, like how much do I have to spend time face to face biologically connecting with someone before that triggers that link, as opposed to watching a lie on a movie, which may or may not trigger that biology. So we need to understand the biology of emotion. materialists have been going on and on for, forever, that it's all just, neurons and this, that, the other, that consciousness is an illusion. They just don't bother to do the research that actually correlates with attachment and things like that, to actually be able to stick a needle in or a diode of some kind and say, you are at a 60% attachment level to this person, you're at a 20% attachment level to this person. Based on this person lying to you, you should experience 70% of a trauma. Based on this person, it will be 2% of a trauma. And here's what here's what we're going to do about it. We don't have this data available to us because the scientists that are so busy saying, your feelings and all that, they're just an illusion, are too ineffective to actually deliver the technology that would even allow us to correlate emotional states to our biology. But there is a biological cycle. Now, some things that are very crude, we actually manage to get it right, like the 9-month birth cycle. Now imagine going to a mother at 6 months and saying, I'll give you $50,000 if you'll have the baby right now, because I want to go on a vacation and I don't want you to be pregnant. So, come on. It's just a couple of months. Have the baby. Here's $50,000. Well, this is absurd, because even if you do a C-section and remove the child, it's an underdeveloped, traumatized, and perhaps dead child. So this is idiotic. It's just as idiotic to try and pay a watermelon seed to sprout faster, or to coax it to, or negotiate. There are biological cycles that need to be understood. Now, these may be quite subjective. One person may have a 3-day disattachment cycle, and another person may have a 30-day disattachment cycle. Well, obviously, a community is, if you look at, let's imagine a trapeze act where two people are holding on to a silk scarf that's looped up above a trapeze, and if either one lets go, the other one falls. So they both need to position themselves to be ready for the fall. Now, if one person is ready to fall at 3 seconds and the other person is ready to fall at 10 minutes, and the 3-second person lets go and the other person falls, they've got no more act. The circus may close down in the insurance claim. You've got to do something in a way that works well for both people. Now, we don't understand that in our very narrow-minded sense of personal freedom. I can't tell you the number of women and men who will just abruptly stand up, say, or shut down the phone call by saying, I've got to go. Okay, well, you've got to go. Is that it? Or do I get to finish my sentence? Do I get to finish my thought? Do I get to wind down biologically and we make this decision together? No. We make the plans together, but we end them unilaterally. I say, do you have time for a call at 6 p.m.? I look in my calendar. Yes, I do. And we make a plan together. And then I say, I've got to go. And 2 seconds later, I unilaterally disengage. Well, my biology is not aligned with that. So I ask someone to give me at least 15 minutes notice of a date or something. Could we actually wind down? Could we check in? How was it? Can we integrate what's gone on here? No. And so there's this interesting fight with the biology. The biology, the integration, there's this sense of it'd be like a contractor who just stops installing your house that is half built because they've got a new job. And just says, "Oh, see you later. I'll keep the money I'm done for so far. You can finish it with someone else or whatever. Just bye." And of course, we have a contract that ensures you don't get a half-built skyscraper or a half-built app on someone's whim. But we don't have these types of understandings, empathies, and contracts for relationship. I think a very good contract is to understand how things will disengage and integrate, as well as how things will begin and grow healthily. So we're lacking protocols that work. Now, how do you know that you're lacking protocols that work when most of the relationships have very measurable areas of pain, dysfunction, trauma, and ending, and do not work? That's how you know. Or, when many relationships are in this state where there's good stuff and there's bad stuff, and I don't really know if it's worth it. So a technology for relating, first of all, has to have protocols that work. Secondly, it has to have a paradigm that works. That paradigm must include the biology of the relationship. Just to give an example, I once suckled a woman's milk. And after 10 minutes of suckling at her breast, she'd recently had a child, and I was just curious. After 10 minutes of suckling at her breast, this is a woman I don't spend time with socially. This is a woman I don't particularly like. I don't particularly dislike her either. It's just my doorway in was the experience, the biological experience, and after 10 minutes I felt protective of this woman. I felt protective, I felt nurturing, I felt hospitable. I felt closer to her. I kind of looked around to see, what would make her life more comfortable. This is 10 minutes. This is biology. Now, this is not to discount it. If you don't understand the fact that every emotion has a biological correlation, that every biology has an emotional correlation, it is a faulty science. So we need to understand how to induce the kinds of emotional states that we want to induce. For example, suckling on a mother's breast, if it can produce protectiveness for the women in the community, it might be a good practice for every man to spend 10 minutes suckling on a mother's breast, from that point forth having a biological cue to look out for that baby, to look out for that mother. We've got a new member in our community, and we need to be more sensitive. Well, if 10 minutes of breast sucking can replace 3 hours of guilt tripping and different book reading and essays from universities, and then you're still absent-minded, well, is it not unscientific to place social dogma or social prejudice, which is about the most unscientific thing on the planet? What cultures end up doing for bizarre reasons are very unhealthy in many situations. Should we elevate a cultural dogma ahead of the biological reality that works to create well-being in that community? You see, we're looking at the idea in a supposedly scientific era of actually looking at data to determine decisions of well-being in healthy relationship, rather than what is in many cases the trumped-up bigotry and chauvinism of hundreds or thousands of years of absurd cultural ignorance. Whether it's rusty clitorises, rusty knives being used to mutilate genitals in some cultural phenomena as a transition into womanhood, or Americans being sent off to school without a single hour of emotional literacy, or having anything but shame dispensed towards their intense emotions. These are cultural these are cultural dogmas of profound stupidity on all sides that are getting in the way of science actually finding what creates sustainable levels of well-being mentally, emotionally, physically, logistically, and financially for groups of people. What's the right size? What's the right protocols? What's the right technology? And when we can really get behind data, which begins with experimentation, why this is not being done is truly evil in its blind stupidity. When you can have 100 people tomorrow testing this and 100 people tomorrow testing this and doing comparisons, the fact that it's not being done is a joke when we're dealing with our planetary relationship, our family relationships, our personal marriage relationships, at the level of violence, addiction, pain management, compulsiveness, and disconnection that we're dealing with in this culture. It is bizarre, absolutely bizarre. Take the breast milk example. If a scientific study is done tomorrow that shows that men treat women better by X% after 10 minutes of breastfeeding, are we going to be so ignorant as to focus on the fact that the mainstream media, which is a joke in and of itself in terms of what it thinks relevant for informing the people, is going to have a field day in our culture displaying the chauvinism, the taboos, and the bigotry, which just means they're going to play off the laughter of discomfort. So are we going to not do something scientifically that can save millions of women's lives, that can help raise children more effectively, because we don't want it joked about on a late-night show by idiots who play off the discomfort of a bigoted culture, like any taboo, which just means it's something that everyone agrees not to talk about, which is important to talk about. A taboo is something that is important to understand and talk about, that everyone in a cult decides not to talk about. And then humor is you get up to that edge of discomfort, fear, and panic, and you have laughter because it's so dumb that it's not able to be talked about. And so you have this thing like, oh, I wouldn't want to be joked about by a talk show host referencing the bigotry and taboos of our culture. So no scientist. It's like, what a coward. These people call themselves scientists, but are really cultural bigots that measure this but not this and don't talk about this for all kinds of political reasons. This is why we're in this fix. Because people aren't doing the science that matters. They're not doing the documentaries that matter. What matters in a time like ours is the skill. And think about this. There's going to be a time in probably the next 50 years where 20 to 100 people are going to set off to Mars or a base on the moon. And they're going to be living together 24/7 with nowhere to take a time out, with nowhere where I've got to go. You see, they're actually going to have to be together. And you have to think, can the typical American pull that off? And if not, is there going to be a shootout and the whole Mars colony becomes extinct because we didn't bother to do the science of biology on how to disconnect gracefully, or how to be honest, or how to deal with lies, that someone would rather commit suicide, except they blew a hole in the space station after they killed themselves because the bullet kept going and now there's no space station. We've got to deal with these kinds of issues in the next 50 years. And we're not doing the science. We think it's intelligent to spend nothing on the most basic experiments that we could be building up to create one of the most powerful, unified, sustainable communities in the history of the planet. Environmentally, socially, with our children, scientifically. We have the potential to do that. And we've got more of the most brilliant minds trying to figure out how to get ad money off of Google or YouTube than we have doing basic experiments on how to build a 10x cohesive community. So this is really, really bizarre. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre form of intelligence. It is a complete lack of science. It is a very unhealthy disregard for our future potential and our needs as a people today, which nobody's hurting for needing another TV. People are hurting because they're watching TV next to a wife and they don't know how to connect emotionally with the person sitting right next to them. That's the pain in the world in the West today. So where's the science about this? Hello? You want to be a dogmatic, materialist, rationalist, reductionist, intelligent human beings? Okay, do the science on that. You figure that out. If you can't, then stop pretending, you're so committed to this dogma. Now, what do we do? What is a protocol when you realize someone's lying to someone you care about? What's the protocol when you realize a stranger is lying to someone else that someone cares about? They're being lied to. What's the protocol of someone being, cheating? What's the protocol of someone having unsafe sex with a sexually transmitted disease and not telling the other person and passing that disease around the community? What's the it's not my community, it's doing that with someone else. Oh yeah, and someone in that town is doing it with your daughter. And someone else knows about it and your daughter doesn't. It's we've got to realize that what goes on outside the screen comes back, is connected. So in this kind of scenario, I think the value of small groups linked with the technology of 360 shared vision with scientific protocols, with a protocol that says if we've got this area of pain in this community, like it looks like 5% of people in our community are being unfaithful. Okay, what are the bits of that have to happen? So one person has to want to cheat, and another person has to let them cheat. Okay, so which is the easiest part of that problem to solve? And how do we rebuild trust when that happens? Do we have how about a circle? This is the power of small groups when you're dealing with 75 people and you're all meeting regularly and having meals and things like that. And there's an infidelity. At lunchtime, there can be a circle. I was unfaithful to you about this and this and this. It was because of this and this and this. I allowed it because of this, this, and this. And the underlying issues can begin to be talked about, as well as the grief and pain shared and held in that circle so that it moves biologically through and clears out rather than festering into a 10-year revenge cycle because the biology has not been honored. There is a biology of grief. If you do not emote physiologically in a certain intensity in a certain way, the grief chronically affects your body. We don't want that in the community. If anger is suppressed, it chronically eats away in your body. You see, so there's a biology of emotion. There's a biology that creates the emotion, and there's a biology that releases the emotion. And we need to understand what that is. And we need to utilize regular ritual that allows the biology to flush through all the emotions, so we're staying in the present. Because the most competitive form of consciousness is a consciousness that is completely in the present by being biologically connected to the present, not to the grief that wasn't cried 10 years ago, not to the beating that was, we have systems of child rearing. We have systems of child rearing in our country where children are beaten and then they start crying to release the biology, as a healthy child knows how to do, to release the terror so they can come back in their body. And then their parent hits them and tells them, don't make a sound. Are you trying to embarrass me with the neighbors? I mean, surely the biggest concern is the neighbors when you're traumatizing your own child, but that's our culture. And then communicates to the child that their beating will go up if they release the biology of their beating. If they release the chemicals of terror. And so now we have a child with PTSD so that a parent can beat their child in the illusion of control that the neighbors do not think worse of them, while they have just committed their child to an extra 30-40% of biological burden for the rest of their life, because when they start crying, their body tells them they're going to die, because they've got parents at such a level of ignorance they don't understand the biology of trauma in a culture that is equally ignorant. It's nothing personal about that parent. So we have to actually understand these things. We have to understand that when we're dealing with 20, 40, 50, 60% of coping mechanisms, where someone has chronic fatigue from all the anxiety of this, where someone is going numb, where someone turned sociopathic at some point from holding in this terror for 4 decades and just unloads on some poor innocent who then they don't want anyone knowing that they unloaded on some poor innocent, so they do the same thing. Don't you tell anyone or I'll kill you, or whatever it is. And then we have the sociopathic abuse cycle, and everyone's happy because it's not happening out in the open. This is the ignorance and the stupidity of the taboo, as opposed to the science of engaging with what's going on. So we need to consider that a healthy school or a healthy community or a healthy culture, one, links impact over time and gathers data. It gathers data on everyone involved in the circle. When you find that one person is having 80% of the affairs in your community, you've got 2 problems. You have, obviously, a lot of unhappy relationships, or you don't have affairs. You have a lot of distrust and pathology of lying, or you don't have affairs. And then you have one person meeting the needs of all these people. So you have a couple of problems. Why does the one person not feel that they're worthy of being truly known and honored in the community and relationship? Because an affair doesn't do that. And where is the compulsion or the sex addiction coming in? What's the trauma that's not being dealt with that nobody is talking about? We don't know what that is. And what is it that we're not doing right that's creating this? So when you have that in the metadata, this can begin to be addressed to restore the level of trust and health in the community to a point where it can be, you ideally do not have any discrepancy between the metadata feature in the app and the other feature, what people talk about. Now, the degree of discrepancy between what goes on in the metadata and what goes on in the face-to-face polite conversation is the degree of disease in that culture. In a very healthy culture, there is no difference. The metadata matches the other. People don't bother using the metadata feature. So we can measure the unhealth of a culture by using the metadata feature. and responding to it as a disease, as a health crisis, rather than as a moral shaming type of dynamic. If people are addicted to adrenaline and their marriages are not providing enough adrenaline, the question is, why are they addicted to adrenaline? The question is, can we bring in a level of science where we can actually test people for adrenaline deficiency? Are we there yet that we can actually correlate things biologically where we know what's going on? And if we understand that people are responding to their environment, then we can start looking at the fact that this is an environment that we are co-creating, that are creating these statistics and these biological responses. What do we need to do? So this is my initial brainstorming on this topic, and I look forward to your thoughts.